to have Marian. I don't even know your last name.
Vidal Fernandez, very
Marian
easy.
Vidal Fernandez for the second time here in URB. Well, Marian works in labor economics, and she's gonna talk today about their other ethics. So you have like 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Susanna. It's nice to actually, I remember being, it could be the same room 10 years ago almost, yeah. Thank you so much for having me again here. It's a pleasure. I hope that the topic is more or less entertaining for everyone, because I think that the good thing about the birth order, and we'll see now, is that everyone can kind of relate to their siblings, or if you don't have siblings, then your parents' siblings, and so on. This is joint work with G and Anna, who were my PhD colleagues, and we started actually probably 10 years ago working on the first paper on this. This is kind of a spin-off, yeah, so we've been working on it. So what is the birth order effect? Basically, I think it can be summarized with the 3 little pigs. I don't know if you know the story, no? That the youngest one builds a house made out of straw, and then the middle one has a wooden house, and then you have the eldest who has the brick house and actually saves all the rest of the pigs. And this is just a little bit of a tale to explain you what, in common knowledge or popular knowledge has been seen as, the eldest being the more successful child, and so on. It's actually true when you go in the data in terms of adult economic outcomes such as education and wages. And what is exactly what we find? So basically what you find is that in developed countries, the earliest you've been born within the same family, then the more likely it is that you have higher educational attainment or earnings. And this is kind of a linear effect, okay? So if you are born the second instead of the first one, you're slightly worse than the first one, but if you are the third one, then you're slightly worse than the second one, but way worse than the first one. Okay? This is a significant source of within family inequality, and actually the origin of this literature in economics, because this is something that in terms of height had been documented before by the medicine literature, started as a little bit of a way to explain the origins of the family quantity trade-off effect. So basically, we had assumed for many years in labor economics that in families that had more children, then the reason why they had worse outcomes on average was because there is a quantity-quality trade-off. So you want equality in all your children, and when you have more, you have to divide your resources, and that's why on average, those children are doing worse. But what Black et al. Showed in 2005 in a QTE paper is that when you actually take into account birth order, then that relationship between more children and the quality of their children being worse is actually greatly partly driven by the birth order. Okay, so that means that the reason why I see on average worse outcomes of families with that are bigger is partly because the children who are born later are actually doing way worse off. And when you put a birth order into the regression, then it's just an omitted variable bias in which most of that quantity-quality trade-off that's been documented is actually driven by birth order. And the way they do it is by using twins as an exogenous source of birth order. And they also they show that even though we still find that family size matters, birth order is actually capturing a lot of it. And then from then onwards, then there are a lot of papers that try to, this is in Norway with really large administrative data. There are myriad of papers that look at the same effect in developed countries. And they find exactly the same, okay? That, the more children are born within the same family, then the worse the outcomes. And a recent, for instance, the more recent one that I can find in terms of economic outcomes also on crime. When we started our other paper, not the one I'm going to show today, we were wondering, so why is that? Why is that there is a birth order effect? well, we've dismissed the family size story, even though you take into account family size, or you look at fixed effects, family fixed effects, you still find that birth order effect. It could be because as you have more children, obviously the per capita income that you have is worse, and therefore you cannot invest as much. But if you actually take that into account, then nothing changes. So if you look at how income changes per capita as more children are born, then you still find that effect. You could think that there must be some biological reason why the ones who are born later are born at a disadvantage. But in reality, what you see is that if you look at birth outcomes, children who are born later are actually born heavier and healthier. So if anything, at birth, children who are born later are actually at an advantage in a sense. And that's a choice that parents don't really have anything to do in the sense of it's not something that they choose. So it's not biological differences at birth. It doesn't seem that there is anything that changes in the household that drives that in terms of income. And what we did in the other paper is looking at not only the amount of time that parents invest, which decreases, but that still could not explain those differences, but the quality of time that parents invest in children. So what we found in the other paper is that as more children are being born, the quality in terms of cognitive stimulating activities that parents devote to subsequent children is worse. Okay? Even though parents are supporting them emotionally equally, what really seems to drive that in early childhood is the quality of that time that they invest. Now, while we were doing that paper, we realized that there are a couple of papers that find a reverse birth order effect. Okay? So there are, so we knew only, at the time when we started working, we only knew about the one in the Philippines that found a positive birth order effect. That means that children who are born later on are actually doing better. Then when we started the paper, then we saw another one, and then recently there's been a couple in India that find conflicting effects, positive and negative. And this kind of brings us to the next puzzle, which is, there must be something, we know it's not biological, we know that the parents are doing something, that it's related to the context, that makes a change in the way that parents behave, that it can affect children within the same family unequally, that it seems to be different from developed and developing countries. So we thought, okay, can we try to first find that context, and this is what we're going to do, what we try to do next, in which we have a long span of data in a country that has changed over time, and see if we find whether contextual differences change, whether the birth order effect is a modern phenomenon or not, and whether there is some heterogeneity in terms of family characteristics and contextual characteristics in which we see a birth order effect that differs. And then finally, in our attempt, because we looked, and you'll see, into a long data span, we wanted to look if that change or not in the birth order effect is related to GDP growth. Okay, so whether there are, we can see that a pattern of change in birth order effects that relate to GDP growth. For those who I'm going to lose in the way, or if we don't get to the end, we see that for the period of study and the country that we studied, I'll give you the details now, the birth order effect does not seem to be a modern phenomenon. We do see some interesting heterogeneity features in our data in terms of changes in the birth order effect depending on the characteristics of families and the contextual situation. And we do not seem to find a birth order effect changing significantly over that time relative to the GDP growth that that country experiences. Okay. And here is a little bit where we kind of answer some things, but the puzzle is still there. So we look at the Netherlands. Why the Netherlands? Because we find that we have information from the 1820 to 1830s until almost 100 year span, so the early 20th century. If we look at the GDP graph here, let's see if I can make, yes, here there is that. Okay. So, okay. I don't think that the, this one, wait. Okay, yes. So, we see that the GDP growth over the period span that we study, which is basically this, from here to here, there is a significant GDP growth. We also see some changes in demographics, so there's lower mortality and a decrease in the number of children that individuals have. But basically what really drives us is the rich data availability. So we get a sample of administrative data that's been linked, and these are marriage and birth records. And you can actually use fixed effects because you can draw a picture of the family tree. Okay, so you can compare siblings' outcomes within the same family.
So this is longitudinal data. So
I'll
how do
explain.
you?
I'll explain that to you. So it's so these are registries. So what you basically find is a random sample of, let's say, an individual from whom you look at his or her marriage certificate, and with the names of the parents you can, in our case we use the father as the linkage, you can find the children, and you can also link it to the parents. Okay, so it's not cross-sectional, it's not longitudinal, but you have that done every year for several cohorts. In every cohort you have a representative sample, and then for that individual they look at all the registries that you can link to that individual, which are basically birth and marriage certificates. Unfortunately we don't have the certificates, and that's a little bit of a drawback, because we know all the children that have been born for a particular family, but we don't know if they die whenever they don't get married. Okay, so you see the birth certificate, you see the father. I have some information on the occupation of the person who marries and also the father's occupation. But if I link it to, like, let's say 8 children, because at that time they had a lot of children, I can only find that children in adulthood if they get married. So if you have someone who does not get married or passes away, I don't know. But I know how many children you have.
So you don't have attrition, but you can be sure that you have the whole family.
Exactly. Yes.
Or if they migrate.
Yes, although at that time migration was, I mean, you can technically find them if, let's say, you are born somewhere and then you're married somewhere, but because this is through the last names and the names of the father, but not if they move to another country. But at the time, while there was some migration into cities, I haven't checked, but I would think that migration into other countries wasn't so common as it is now. But I'll check. So we have linked family information of parents, siblings, spouses, and children of the individual who's been randomly selected. What is the information you find in the registries? Is the year of birth, the gender, the family composition that you can kind of picture, the occupation, if it's a marriage and you provide an occupation. Then every time that you have a child, you would get information on that occupation as well. The municipality, and sometimes religion. even though at the time you might think that people did some religious ceremonies, all these registries actually civil registries, and there are linked to religion, so they were not a religious event. So that's why it's also voluntary, and some people don't provide it. So the actual event was not linked to any particular religion. And with that particularly, I'm referring to marriages. Then, out of everyone that we have a picture, a family picture, we take family with at least 2 brothers, because women rarely reported an occupation. This is something that we might want to dig into further with the whole administrative data in the future, but for this project, what we have is a sample of that administrative data, and women rarely report an occupation. Although I think that for the time, if you look at the whole picture, there are a significant amount of women who do. Then, because we want to do fixed effects, we need to have at least 2 brothers, so that limits our sampling to families who have at least 2 men born. Then we need to have the brothers and the father's occupation valid, because we want to look at heterogeneity in regards to parental background. If there are several occupations reported, we take the highest that they report. And we limit the sample, even though it starts at 1820, we limit it to be after that civil code, because there is a change in terms of the inheritance that can affect the results, and I'll discuss that. So we limit the sample to start at in 1838. And we would not have, what I mentioned before, anyone who's been born, but either they die, or they don't get married, or they don't have children, or they don't provide a valid occupation. Then we use 2 sources of information in terms of economic outcomes. This is a data set that has been gathered by historians and demographers, and they've done an amazing job. And one of the things that is included in this data is the HIS class, which is a classification of 13 categories that they've ranked, and that we've divided into manual and non-manual. We use, in the next slide, I'll show you a more fine definition of occupation and economic outcomes, but we thought it was interesting to just have also a linear outcome 0-1, in which you had a clear concept of what that means. So even though we lose some information here, we have another classification that is finer, and that I'll show you right away. So we divide these 13 categories that have been standardized using a lot of data, historical data sets in Europe, and validated, and the same with the next set of variables, and just divided into manual and non-manual occupations as a mock. Now, the second one, it's what's called the HISCA, and it's also being validating using not only the name of the occupation, but also the proportion of individuals who have this occupation and the family relationships with the family. Here, what we did is we take that rank as given. So they basically take and rank all the occupations, and we assume that that rank is properly done. And then for us to pin down a measure that we kind of can feel better is to take that rank as given and taking the percentile of individuals within your cohort who are below that rank to get a percentile measure. So in every cohort, we're going to have a proportion of individuals who are ranked in a particular rank that they've developed, and we look at the percentile of individuals who are below that particular profession. And we do that for every cohort, so that we take into account changes, compositional changes in labor. And as I said before, if we have multiple occupations, we take the highest one.
But Marian, sorry,
Yes.
but are you gonna track the changes in these people's occupations? Because every time there is a registry, because for example they have a child,
Yes.
they might the occupation might be different, right?
Yeah, so we do two things.
Tracking these changes so that you can see sort of social mobility or something or not?
Well, that's not really the focus of the paper, but it could be because we want to isolate the changes in the birth order effect. We don't want to confound them with that, and then we do two things. First, we accounted for the cohort, the changes in the compositional proportion of individuals who are below that rank in that year. Okay, so for that particular cohort, for everyone who is born in the same year. So you're only comparing people who are born in the same year. Plus, in the last set of regressions, which I didn't have the time to update, we also put we include the year in which the event happened. Because if you think that systematically people who are born earlier will going to have more
so in other words, so your unit of analysis is the individual and also the year. Is individual and
well, in the outcome, yes, but not in the manual and non-manual, but yes, in the other
one.
But you also have cohort fixed effects on top of that, yes. Now, this is one thing that I haven't said now, but I think it's obvious. This is a descriptive exercise, okay? This is a descriptive paper. Therefore, the estimation is quite straightforward. We look at either the probability of holding a non-manual occupation, being that positive, holding a non-manual occupation, or the occupational percentile, which gives us more information on the birth order. And here for the birth order, we have a linear effect. I'll show you then dummies, but it gives us a little bit more power. We cannot reject that the effect is linear, like in the previous literature. And we cap it at 10. So it's up to 10 individuals. We have a family that's 25. In the current literature, it's up to 4. So if you have 4 and more, it's just 4. But in this context, because people had more children, we capped it at 10. But it doesn't really matter when you do that. And then what we can control for at the individual level, because we have family fixed effects, or better said, father's fixed effects. We have the gender of individual, the cohort, we have also region fixed effects, and here in the new set of regressions, we also have the date of when the event took place. And then the other thing that we know is important from the birth order literature is to take into account the age gap between siblings. Okay, so the larger the gap, then the larger the effect. So we include that as well.
But Marian, yes, I'm sorry, but what I told you before, so I don't see it here. So for example, the occupation percentile is for that person, but when? Because it might be different. And I don't see the time index here.
So you have individual so you have cohort fixed effects.
Yeah, sure. But what I'm saying is
and the percentile is calculated in your cohort as well.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that it might change.
But you have I've counted that for, because I'm comparing you only with people who are in your cohort. You see what I mean? I don't want to put, yeah.
No, but what I'm saying is, person A,
yes.
When he had his first child,
yes.
he was in the, I don't know, in the 20% percentile.
I'm also having the year in the event took place. The registry took place. It's not in this formula, but I've always, first I'm only taking the latest one the highest.
Okay, so that's, yes. I guess that was my question. You take the latest one. Okay.
But imagine that firstborns are getting married later, right? Then that's systematically related to both occupational outcome.
You have the best occupation for that person.
Yes, okay. But because it could be systematically related to birth order, I also included in the last set the year in which the event took place, which doesn't matter, but yeah.
And on average, the family has how many members? How many children? Because you have
8.
family fixed effects, so you identifying within the...
Yes. I'll show you OLS too. But consistent with the previous literature, even though people like to take that into account, to see that the changes doesn't change too much. Yes, so the problem with the fixed effects obviously is that you might observe more individuals in larger families, right? And that's why you show the OLS too. But on the other hand, you also take into account all these things that are related to the fact that you have more children, and you might be different from those who are lower. And so that's why in the first regressions in this literature, generally you show both OLS and fixed effect. And here is the first, I guess the answer to the first question, which is the birth order effect a modern phenomenon? Not in the Netherlands in 18 to early 1900s. So basically, to get an idea of what these coefficients mean, being born a birth order higher on average, so second to the third or third to the fourth, decreases your probability of having a non-manual occupation by 0.6 percentage points. Okay? This seems like a small effect, but it really depends on what is your birth order, right? Because if you're the 10th birth order and comparing with the first one, it increases significantly. If you look at the occupational percentile, this effect, which is being born a birth order higher, decreases your occupational percentile by 0.5 percentile points. It is more or less the same effect that if you run a regression with cohort fixed effects and individual fixed effects, your father having a percentile higher is more or less the same effect. Okay, so having a father who has a percentile higher in the scale has more or less the same effect in terms of your own percentile. Okay, so in our data. So it's a negative effect. It is significant, and it seems to be consistent with what we find in developed countries nowadays. However, the first thing that we do is you always have to check this, right? So it's like the OLS and the fixed effect. Even though we find that if you put the individual dummies of birth orders, so instead of putting a linear trend in terms of birth order second, third, and fourth, you put individuals, you cannot dismiss that they enter the function linearly. Here is what we do. So you put the dummies, second, third, fourth, 5, and so on, and they are negative, but they don't seem also very different from each other. So most of the effect seems to be driven by the firstborn. Okay? And in fact, that's why then we start looking at a regression in which we enter the firstborn separately. And this is new, in a sense. This is something that we found in this context that actually seems consistent with some recent literature in Sweden as well, that there is a strong firstborn in terms of non-cognitive abilities. And for that particular reason, then we bring it also in some of the other regressions that we see, because we see that most of that average birth order effect is actually driven by a strong firstborn. Now, we look at two particular sources of heterogeneity. One is, how does the birth order effect changes with things that change within the family? And the second is, how does the birth order effect change with socio-contextual circumstances? And in this case, so the first thing that we see is that most of it is a firstborn effect. By the way, I need to know how am I doing in terms of... okay.
20 minutes, no, 20 minutes.
Okay. And then the other thing that we can look at is gender composition of siblings. So what we see, so this again, this is consistent with Sweden in very recently. That is also seems to be a firstborn effect. But this, the second panel, looks at what if there is some differences in the birth order effect depending on who are you competing against. If you're competing with sisters or with brothers. And here we can see that for brothers, if we look at fixed effects, right, it matters more to have more brothers, or even if you look at OLS, but we are going to take OLS out for the rest of the regressions. What really matters for brothers is whether you have more brothers. So having more brothers worsens the birth order effect. And this is actually consistent with some recent evidence in India, where there is a gender mitigation of the effect if you have more girls in the family. Okay, so what we are learning basically with this exercise is that we seem to find some results that are consistent with recent results in developed countries, but others that are actually consistent with developing countries. In terms of the firstborn, one thing that I want to tell you now, before I might run out of time, is that one of the things that comes first to mind is, well, maybe it's an inheritance rule. You know, at the time, the firstborn was the person who would inherit, and therefore the other ones would have to divide the estate, and that's why there is this strong effect. However, the reason why we take the timeline from when the Dutch Civil Code was passed is precisely because after that Dutch Civil Code was passed, the state was to be equally divided among siblings and the remaining spouse. However, in Saxon regions, they did not follow that tradition, and what we do is to take the Saxon regions out, and we still find the same effect. So it does not seem, with what we can test, which is that, and also looking at self-employed individuals, that firstborn effect is driven by, even though it was not a rule, people might be trying to bend it and get the firstborn that privilege. Yes?
You use inheritance, so you mean the quantity of money that you receive when your parents die. That's the idea.
Well, we don't have that information, so...
But that is conceptually when you are...
Yes, exactly.
However, that is not necessarily the most important part. It could be that the expectations, and therefore what you help that child to achieve for the firstborn would be a higher rank, occupation, like getting into the church or the military or something like that. So at that time, I don't know in the Netherlands, but in our society, as you may know, there were some sort of expectations clearly defined in terms of what you should do, depending on both the gender and the birth order. So the first one was supposed to be whatever, the second one maybe. So in this case, maybe the first order, this firstborn effect, it could be because some of the resources and expectations that were located in specific occupations. I don't know if you have had the opportunity to check that. For instance, there is some regularity for firstborn male children, some more less diverse set of occupations. Have you checked on that?
I haven't looked at diversity. Obviously, if we look at the outcomes, they are doing better, so they're going to be on the highest rank, but we could look at whether they concentrated into 3 top occupations. We could do that, yes.
Because that would be an alternative to your explanation to...
No, there are many, so yes, but what I'm saying is that exactly, and I can check it. So what I'm saying is that for that firstborn story, we've done that, we've checked that, and in your case, we could also check that as well, which is, we can have many stories, but the idea is to try with what we have to...
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that, if I understand you correctly, you are splitting into kind of a psychological or a more pecuniary type of reasons to explain that. And in this case, it wouldn't be needed.
Yes, no, we are not saying, no, I started explaining what we know for now, right? Like, as in saying, okay, this is what we know for the birth order, and this is what we can explain for recent data. The fact that we find a similar effect doesn't mean that the reasons why we find it are the same as what we find for, children nowadays. Okay, does that make sense? And this is what we wanted to explore. The first question is just, because there is actually some inconsistency into the positive and negative effect, there must be something actually beyond, which could be culture, meaning many things, beyond what individuals choose, that changes that birth order effect. Okay, and we kind of thought, well, what is a way to explain it? Let's just move out of that context, move to another context and a long time span. But this limits us in terms of things that we can test. But this we can definitely go ahead with. Then what we looked at is also trying to look at heterogeneity in terms of the socio-economic circumstances of the families. And the first thing that is relatively easy to check is whether having a father who is more advantaged in terms of their percentile or being non-manual has some mitigating or exacerbating effect. And as you can see, these are all fixed effects. We've moved from the OLS. In the top panel we have only birth order, and the second we include the firstborn. I keep going there, but we can go here. Is that having a non-manual father, so a father who has more, a better job, actually makes it worse within the family for those who are born late. So it kind of points at the story that it seems that more advantaged circumstances, there is the possibility of making that difference among brothers. Here is just a way to show this. Actually, I keep going here because I see it better and I'm a little bit blind. Here is a way to see this graphically with both regressions. Here we have the father's percentile of occupation, and you can see that for the light gray, which is not so obvious as with the firstborn, but the higher the percentile of your father, then the more negative is the birth order effect. And if you look at the firstborn advantage is higher, the higher the rank, percentile rank of your father. Now, the other thing that we can do with our data is look at geographical differences. Here we do that in two ways. The first way is to look at the definition that historians did in terms of type of region, and they divide the country into urban, which is the dark gray area, modern agriculture, which is a market-based agriculture, and just a rural area here. And the second thing that we do, and I'll show you now both of the results, is to look at the first census that we have, 1860, and then we looked at where people were living in 1860, and we assigned whether they were a city or not. Okay, so whether they live in a city or not. So we do both things, and it seems that consistent with that story that if you think that there is higher growth in urban areas, which there was at the time, economic growth, the firstborn advantage, both in cities or what we define as urban areas, is higher in more urbanized areas where economic growth was happening more strikingly over the time. Now, here comes the passage that we haven't found, and I want to explain this properly, because here we're actually taking cohort effects into account. Even though we see that urban areas seem to have an advantage, if you look at birth order effect over time, so you run the same regression by 5 years of time, so you run the same regression that we do in of birth order in 5 years, we've been taking still cohort effects into account. The birth order effect here seems to be a bit noisy and growing, but doesn't change strikingly over time, and it doesn't also map the growth pattern that we saw. One thing that I want to highlight is that we are taking into account here all the compositional effects that might change. We're only interested in the birth order effect. So we are taking into account the fact that over time there might be compositional effects that make later borns have better jobs and so on. But in terms of just the birth order effect, we don't see too much going on when we put everything together. The other thing that we do, instead of asking so much for the data, because again we are just running regressions on 5-year sets, is two things. First, look at the linear effect, and I'll explain you this why we do 2 stages. But looking at the linear effect instead of taking groups of 5 individuals, 5-year cohorts, and also look at the effect in urban versus non-urban areas. If we want to look at the linear effect, which is basically here for the firstborn effect and for the order of birth, what we do in a previous stage is putting all the dummies of all the years. And the reason why we do that first stage is because in some years there are very few individuals born, and we need to correct for the standard errors. And the way to do that is first estimating that linearly, take all the estimates that we get for every one of the cohorts, and then get that linear year of birth effect that we're interested in. And then we do that both for everyone, and then for urban, rural, and cities. So basically we are doing what we did in the graph, but trying to ask less of the data. However, we correct for the standard errors. And when we do that, what we can see is that over time, the firstborn advantage seems to actually be a little bit higher per year in urban areas and cities. Okay? It's not very big. I take those as a grain of salt, but it seems that over time, the birth order disadvantage or the firstborn advantage does seem to be grow faster in areas that are growing also faster. But it's a relatively small effect. What else do we do that I'm not going to probably show you is we look at religion, because there is some literature that shows that Protestants tend to, and there are a lot of Protestants in this area, tend to invest more in reading and literacy, which improves the economic outcomes of Protestants versus Catholics. We look at both your own declared religion, and also whether you live in a region that's Catholic versus Protestant. We don't find too much going on, to be honest. So we didn't find any obvious heterogeneity among religious and non-religious types of families. Then other things that we do is we look at the results by family size. We also look at the birth order index to account for the fact that larger families have more observations. We drop the success regions as I discussed earlier, and then we looked at self-employed because we think that maybe if the father has an occupation that can only, or like a business that can only, that cannot be divided, and the first one receives it, then it could be the case that that's driving the first born effect. And nothing extremely interesting there, and the results are pretty robust to what we've tried. And in terms of the questions that we had, we seem to find a birth order effect that's already present in the mid-19th to mid-20th century Netherlands in terms of occupational outcomes. We find a strong positive firstborn effect, which is consistent with actually, I've been saying something wrong. The strong positive birth order effect is consistent with India evidence, but the older brothers being more relevant than older sisters for educational outcomes is consistent with data in Sweden. Okay? So we do find in terms of heterogeneity, some results that are actually consistent with recent outcomes in both developed and developing countries. We do find that the birth order effects seem to be larger in relatively more advantaged families, and urban areas where more growth was concentrated seem to have a stronger birth order effect over time. And that effect, however, I would say is mild, and I wouldn't push that too far. And that's pretty much it. I try to go fast.
Yeah, no, you do very well. We still have 5 minutes.
Oh, good. So if you have questions, go ahead.
So does it matter the distance between children?
It does, and that's why we put it in the regression as well. So there is some paper by Casey Pacus that shows that the more you wait in between children, it's better actually so the distance is actually even higher because you have yes, more time. So the higher the distance, then the more worse is the birth order effect.
Why?
Well, basically because I guess that the eldest can understand more that you're being with the second. I don't know. So the less distance.
So it's better off, the second one. There are more years.
Yes, because it's more like a teacher as well. Yeah. So it's if you were going to choose going to have children, then if you can, then more distance is better.
Yeah. Just a general comment. I like very much the work. And also very much how you stress that it's mostly an associational work, and you don't. Yeah. But I was just wondering if you tried to speculate on some causal explanation of this negative relation, if you had any in mind, and also if you think that it could be the same. I mean, you found these negative results for Norway now and for the Netherlands 150 years ago. I don't think it's the same data generating process leading to this result, as the result that brings us to make children is very different.
Yes, and that's why I said
it was somehow connected.
So I can tell you that in our other paper, we seem to be explaining the birth order for nowadays. Okay, so we move back to nowadays in the US. We kind of do like a sync type of regression, and when you take into account the quality of time that parents are investing in their children, it seems to be wiped away. So it seems that consistently parents in developed countries nowadays, not only they spend less time, it's not so much about the time they spend with them, but the cognitive stimulating activities that they devote with the second and so on are decreasing. That's what I can say there. I cannot say anything here. This is what I can say in terms of, there are many things going on. I wouldn't think, I would definitely don't think that the parents at the time would spend any stimulating activities, or very few, with children. So people have changed a lot in terms of, but then the puzzle still remains, in a sense. Why at the time? Then you have to explain, actually, I think that we need to point at other stories. Right? First, because obviously we cannot test that. Second, because I think at the time doesn't make too much sense. And third, because there are things, for instance, in developed countries, and here I'm not saying, oh, this is because they are the same or not. I'm just saying that we find things that kind of are not fully into, that kind of actually point that there must be other reasons, right, in terms of preference of gender, that could still, or a firstborn preference that could be, I think it could be consistent with India and there at the time. But the reason why they have a firstborn preference, I don't know. And it could be, because of inheritance, not because in India it's that the problem, but it's more about marriage markets and so on. And I think the reason why I'm kind of, even though it's a descriptive thing and the policy implication, it's kind of like a long shot, it's the puzzle that kind of still drags me to keep finding that out.
in one of the latest graphs that you show, in any case, it seems that the negative birth order is just a phenomenon from the first years, right? After the 1840s or 1860s.
It's still negative, but it's very small.
Yeah,
yes.
It's not significant.
Yes.
Yeah. So that is puzzling, right? Why there has been that change?
Yes. But also, you can see also that the standard errors in the first years are also a little bigger too, and there are a few years. But yeah, this is, yes.
But probably if you run the regression for those years, you get the negative effect for the others, probably. But
no, because those regressions are actually taking only 5 years into account. I'm actually only taking cohorts of 5 years. Those are a lot of regressions.
When you do this, okay. But and on the other point, on the first child effect, I think that this the occupations is something to check, right? Because perhaps is that the first child is just following the same profession as the occupation as the father. Of course, the father can only have one, so probably you see a lot of repetitive occupations there. And also it happens more, is stronger in the urban places and the cities, so that's probably where these professional occupations are more abundant and all that, so my guess is that has to do a lot with that,
This is something that we
I'm sorry if I missed that, your explanation, but for women, so you have both boys and girls in this.
Yes, so the birth order effect, the birth order is taking into account both men and women. But I'm only looking at brothers.
So if you are, so the first child in a family is a girl,
yes,
then you still consider the first boy as a firstborn, or?
If there are two brothers.
No. The birth order effect is you need to have at least two brothers born, but you can have, let's say, you have a first sister and then a second born boy and a second born boy. Then the second born boy is the second and the third boy is the third. And the birth order is the actual birth order.
So the firstborn is either a boy or a girl?
Yes, I would think so.
It can be a girl in your sample.
It can be a girl, yes, that's why I can look at the gender of
the left-hand side is only for men.
So let's say I don't have it for the outcome because I barely don't have women's outcomes, but the birth order is constructed using both sisters and brothers because I know that they've been born and the order.
So this is a mixed effect of boys and girls, this first order? The first born.
Okay, sorry. So what you're saying, I don't have firstborn girls as an outcome, no. So I have.
So on your left hand side.
Yes.
If it was a.
If it was a girl, I would not have the outcome of a firstborn girl.
So
but if you are a thirdborn boy or a secondborn boy, you will have second as your birth order.
So, for instance.
So basically what happens is, I know for a family the gender and the birth order of all the siblings, and birth order is constructed using your birth order in that family.
But
I'm only looking at men. That's why I only have families in which I have at least two men, so that I can compare the men among each other.
So in this case, it's a firstborn boy.
Because I need the outcome, yes, but I can have a family in which you have a firstborn girl.
But you don't look at the outcome of the first.
No, because I don't have it. I can also look if one exercise that I can do is just look at the birth order of men and only men.
Yeah.
That doesn't allow me to look at the this gender composition effect, but I can do that.
Well, in fact, I don't know if. So I remember reading that it was not only the order, but the combination of gender. So, for instance, being a third-born child, it was different if it was a third boy.
Not nowadays. In the US, it seems that it is in a recent paper, that very recent paper, but actually this is not the US, this is Sweden. But with our previous paper, we looked at the gender composition of siblings and we didn't find anything. It could be because of power too, and because it was a survey data, so...
Well, it was a combination of order and gender.
No, it was only birth order that mattered in our data in the US. Very recently, this matters for Sweden for certain types of occupations that are more like a leader. I think the paper is called Born to Lead, and it's just like CEOs and things like that. Then it does matter. For leadership, it matters whether the order combination of gender and but not for educational attainment, let's say, what we look at, or earnings. But if you look at leadership, it does matter the gender composition, which could actually also be more consistent maybe with what we look at here. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for the